If we don't figure out why he's refusing to leave, he might never have a home. Dr. Rachel Monroe had seen a lot of dogs come through the doors of the Maple Creek Animal Shelter. Some were scared, some were hurt, and others just needed time to trust again. But none had ever refused to leave, even after a loving family had come to take them home. This dog, a golden retriever mix they'd named Charlie, had been adopted twice already, yet both times he'd ended up right back at the shelter, cowering in the same corner of the same kennel. It was as if something was keeping him there, something no one could understand. Rachel knelt down outside Charlie's kennel, her brown eyes soft with concern. He had been found on the outskirts of town, wandering alone near an abandoned gas station. The officer who brought him in said there were no signs of where he had come from. No collar, no chip, just a dog with sad eyes and a hesitant wag of the tail. That had been 3 months ago, and now, despite every effort, Charlie wouldn't leave. Maggie, the shelter's longest-serving volunteer, stood beside Rachel, arms folded over her chest. 2 adoptions, 2 families. Both times he runs away and ends up back here. It doesn't make sense. Rachel glanced at the kennel where Charlie sat, curled up on the blanket they had given him. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't outwardly fearful. He just stayed. "I'm going to do some tests," Rachel said. "Maybe there's something medical going on that we missed. If nothing else, we have to find out why he won't settle anywhere else." Maggie sighed, brushing a few strands of gray hair from her face. "I just want him to be happy." Poor thing. Rachel did too. There was something about Charlie, something in those deep brown eyes that told her he had a story. She just needed to find out what it was. The next day, she brought Charlie into the small examination room, a space filled with the scent of antiseptic and the warmth of years of rescues finding their way to better lives. Charlie didn't resist as she ran her hands over him, checking his ribs, his paws, the back of his ears. He was healthy, well-fed even. If anything, he seemed used to human touch, comfortable in a way that suggested he had known love before. When she checked his microchip again, just to be sure, the scanner beeped unexpectedly. Rachel frowned at the screen. The chip wasn't from a local shelter or a pet store. It was from out of state. Maggie, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "That's new, isn't it?" Rachel nodded. "I don't know how we missed this before, but his chip is registered in California. That's a long way from here." Maggie pursed her lips. "How would he have ended up in a small town in Idaho?" "I don't know." Rachel exhaled and sat back on her stool. "But I'm going to find out." She called the number listed on the registration, hoping for an answer. It rang 4 times before a voice picked up, hesitant. "Hello? Hi, this is Dr. Rachel Monroe, a veterinarian at Maple Creek Animal Shelter in Idaho. I have a dog here with a microchip registered under your name. His name, well, we've been calling him Charlie, but..." The voice on the other end gasped. "Charlie?" Rachel hesitated. "Yes. Do you know him?" Silence. Then a quiet, shaky exhale. "Oh my God, you found him." Rachel's stomach tightened. She put the call on speaker so Maggie could hear. "Can you tell me what happened?" The woman on the other end sniffled, regaining control. "My name is Emily Carter. Charlie, his real name is Cooper, was my dad's dog. My dad passed away 3 months ago. He lived alone in California, and after he passed, we arranged for Cooper to be sent to my brother in Oregon. But the transport company called and said there was an issue, that Cooper had somehow gotten loose at a rest stop in Idaho. We searched, we put out flyers, but we never found him. We thought..." Rachel and Maggie exchanged a look. 3 months ago. The same time Cooper, had been brought in. "You've had him this whole time?" Emily asked, voice thick with emotion. Yes, he's safe, Rachel assured her. But there's something strange. He's been adopted twice, and both times he ran away. Both times he came back to the shelter. Emily's breath hitched. He's looking for my dad. Maggie pressed a hand over her mouth, eyes misty. Rachel swallowed the lump in her throat. Would you be willing to come see him? I'll be there as soon as I can, Emily said. The next morning, Rachel stood outside the shelter, watching the gray sedan pull up. A woman stepped out, her dark blonde hair pulled back, eyes filled with anticipation and sadness. She was holding a leash and a faded blue collar in her hands. Emily barely got through the doors before Cooper lifted his head, ears perking up. His tail, still hesitant, gave the slightest wag. Rachel unlocked the kennel, and as soon as the door swung open, Cooper rushed forward, not to run, not to escape, but to bury his head into Emily's chest. Emily sank to her knees, tears falling freely as she held him. Oh, Cooper, I'm so sorry. Maggie sniffled beside Rachel. That dog never wanted to leave because he thought he still had a home to wait for. Rachel wiped at her own eyes. But now he's going to one. Emily stayed at the shelter for hours, letting Cooper reacquaint himself with her voice, her scent, the gentle touch of someone who knew his past. And when it was time to leave, Cooper didn't hesitate. He walked with Emily out the doors, his tail wagging in a way Rachel hadn't seen before. As they drove off, Maggie sighed. That's one of the happiest endings we've had in a while. Rachel smiled, watching the car disappear down the road. It's not an ending, just a new beginning. Dr. Rachel Monroe sat in her office, staring at her computer screen, but her mind was still on the moment Cooper had left the shelter. It was the way he had finally walked out the doors without hesitation, the way his tail had swayed in a slow, steady rhythm as he climbed into the car beside Emily. He had found his person again, and that was what mattered. But something about it lingered. It wasn't just another adoption, it was different. She had seen plenty of reunions, but never had she come across a case where a dog refused to settle anywhere else. Cooper's story still had missing pieces, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. A knock on her office door pulled her from her thoughts. Maggie poked her head in, her sharp eyes searching Rachel's face. You've been staring at that screen for 15 minutes and haven't typed a single thing. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. I can't stop thinking about Cooper. Maggie stepped inside, settling into the chair across from Rachel's desk. I thought you'd be happy. He's with family now. I am, Rachel admitted. But don't you think it's odd? He traveled so far, only to run away from every home that wasn't this shelter? What was keeping him here? Maggie pursed her lips. Maybe he just felt safe here. Rachel nodded slowly, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Or maybe he was waiting for something. Maggie gave her a long look. You're thinking about taking a trip, aren't you? Rachel let out a small laugh. I was just looking up Emily's father's address in California. Maggie shook her head, but smiled. I should have known. You can't let go of a mystery. Rachel's fingers hovered over her keyboard. I just want to know why Cooper ended up here. Maybe it's nothing. But what if it's something? Maggie leaned back, crossing her arms. So, what's your plan? Rachel tapped her fingers against the desk. I was thinking of driving down there, maybe visiting his old home, seeing if there's anything that might explain how he got all the way to Idaho. Maggie arched a brow. You're going all the way to California for a dog's past? Rachel shrugged. I guess I just feel like I owe it to him. And to Emily. If there's something he was trying to get back to, maybe she should know. Maggie was quiet for a moment, then sighed. Well, I suppose someone has to stay behind and run this place while you're off playing detective. Rachel grinned. So that's a yes? Maggie shook her head with mock exasperation. It's you better keep me updated. The next morning, Rachel packed a small bag, made sure the shelter had everything it needed in her absence, and hit the road. The drive was long, stretching across quiet highways and open fields, then winding into the busier roads of California. As she neared the address Emily had given her, Rachel found herself wondering what she was even looking for. Maybe she wouldn't find anything at all. But if Cooper had been waiting for something, she wanted to know what it was. The house was small, but well kept, with a white fence and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. Rachel parked her car and stepped out, taking in the surroundings. It looked like a place filled with memories, a home that had once been lived in with love. She made her way to the front door and knocked. A woman in her 60s answered, her gray hair pulled into a bun, her sharp eyes studying Rachel carefully. "Can I help you?" Rachel cleared her throat. "Hi, my name is Dr. Rachel Monroe. I work at an animal shelter in Idaho. I believe this used to be the home of Mr. Carter?" The woman's expression softened. "You must be talking about Bill." "Yes, he lived here. I'm his sister Evelyn." Rachel hesitated, then decided to be direct. "I actually came because of his dog, Cooper." Evelyn's breath caught. "Cooper?" Rachel nodded. "He was found in Idaho 3 months ago and ended up at my shelter. We just recently reunited him with Emily." Evelyn's hand went to her mouth. "Oh, that dog loved my brother more than anything." Rachel stepped closer. "Do you have any idea how he might have gotten all the way to Idaho?" Evelyn looked down, sadness shadowing her face. After Bill passed, the plan was to send Cooper to Emily's brother. But something must have gone wrong. Rachel told her about the transport company losing Cooper. Evelyn nodded along, then frowned. "You said he ran away from every home before he was reunited with Emily?" "Yes. It was like he was looking for something." Evelyn's eyes misted. "Maybe he was looking for Bill." Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. "You think he was trying to find his way home?" Evelyn wiped at her eyes. "That dog never left Bill's side. He must have been so lost without him." Rachel nodded, swallowing the emotion rising in her chest. "At least he's with Emily now." Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Yes, and Bill would be so happy to know that." As Rachel drove back, she thought about Cooper's journey. A dog, lost and grieving, trying to find his way back to the only home he had ever known. And when he couldn't, he stayed in the only place that felt safe. The shelter had been his refuge, his waiting place, until fate brought him back to the family he had left behind. Rachel didn't need to know more. She had found the missing piece, and now Cooper's story was one of love, loyalty, and finding home again. And as she crossed back into Idaho, she knew that sometimes the greatest journeys weren't about where you ended up. They were about the love that carried you there. Rachel Monroe pulled into the shelter parking lot just as the sun began its descent beyond the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the modest building. She had spent hours on the road, replaying everything she had learned about Cooper in her mind. The mystery had unraveled in unexpected ways, but it left her with a deep sense of admiration for the loyalty and love that a dog could hold for its owner. There was still work to be done, still questions she couldn't shake, and she knew she wasn't finished with this story yet. Maggie stood at the front doors, arms crossed, watching Rachel step out of her car. "You look exhausted," she said, as Rachel stretched her back. "Long drive?" Rachel nodded, slamming the car door shut, and making her way toward the entrance. Long, but worth it. I talked to Bill Carter's sister. She confirmed everything. Cooper was looking for him. He must have gotten confused after Bill passed and was trying to find his way back. Maggie exhaled and shook her head. That poor dog. To think he traveled all that way because he didn't understand what happened. Rachel sighed, rubbing her forehead. And now he's finally with Emily. I just hope he can heal. Maggie placed a comforting hand on Rachel's shoulder. He's got a second chance now. That's all we can hope for. As they stepped inside the shelter, Rachel's thoughts lingered on Cooper, but the bustle of the shelter quickly demanded her attention. There were new dogs to check on, paperwork to file, and a few adoptions in progress. It was enough to distract her for the moment, though a part of her remained tethered to Cooper's story. The next morning, Rachel was just finishing up feeding the dogs when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw Emily's name. A small jolt of concern ran through her. Was something wrong with Cooper? Hello? Rachel answered quickly. Dr. Monroe, it's Emily. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, Rachel said, stepping into her office for some quiet. How's Cooper doing? Emily hesitated before answering. That's actually why I'm calling. He's doing okay, but he seems restless. He paces a lot, and sometimes he sits by the door, staring like he's waiting for something. He sleeps, he eats, but I can tell something's off. Rachel frowned. That doesn't sound unusual for a dog who's been through so much change, but if he's waiting at the door like that, it almost seems like he still doesn't feel like he's home. That's what I was afraid of, Emily said, her voice tight with emotion. I want him to feel safe, to feel like he belongs here, but I don't know what else to do. Rachel thought for a moment. I could come visit. Maybe seeing a familiar face would help him settle. Would you? Emily sounded relieved. I hate to ask, but you seem to understand him better than anyone else. Of course, Rachel assured her. I'll drive out tomorrow. Let's see if we can help him feel at home. When Rachel arrived the next day, she found Cooper sitting on the front porch, staring into the distance. Emily greeted her with a warm but worried smile. He's been like this all morning. Rachel crouched in front of Cooper, letting him take in her scent before gently scratching behind his ears. Hey, buddy, you remember me? Cooper's tail thumped softly, but his eyes carried the same sadness Rachel had seen back at the shelter. Emily sighed. He does this at night, too. He doesn't bark or whine, just sits there, like he's waiting for something that never comes. Rachel sat down beside him. Dogs understand loss, but they don't always know how to process it. He probably still feels like there's unfinished business. She glanced at Emily. Has he explored much? Maybe if he had a familiar scent, or something to connect with. Emily's brows furrowed. We haven't gone far, just the yard and the block. I didn't want to overwhelm him. Rachel nodded. I think we should take him somewhere that meant something to him. Somewhere Bill took him often. Maybe it will help. Emily thought for a moment before her face lit up slightly. There's a park. My dad used to take him there almost every evening. It was their routine. I haven't taken him yet because I was worried it would upset him. Rachel smiled. Maybe it's exactly what he needs. They drove to the park, with Cooper sitting quietly in the back seat. As soon as they pulled up, his ears perked, his body tensed. Rachel watched as his nose twitched, taking in the familiar scents. As soon as Emily opened the door, Cooper leapt out, his tail wagging slightly for the first time since Rachel had seen him. Emily let out a small gasp. I haven't seen him like this. Cooper moved forward with more certainty than he had since he arrived at Emily's home. He sniffed the grass, the trees, the old bench near the pond where an elderly man sat reading. Then, suddenly, he stopped and turned, staring at something near the edge of the park. Rachel followed his gaze. "What is it, boy?" Slowly, Cooper walked toward a tree near the fence line. He sniffed the base, then whined softly. Emily hurried over. "This was my dad's favorite spot. He used to sit here for hours." Rachel knelt next to Cooper, running a hand over his back. "He remembers. This is what he's been looking for." Emily swallowed hard, kneeling down beside them. "I wish I could explain to him that Dad isn't coming back. I wish I could tell him it's okay to let go." Rachel squeezed her shoulder. "Dogs grieve, just like we do. But maybe this is what he needed, to feel close to him again." Cooper sat down beside the tree, his tail curling around his paws. He looked up at Emily, his deep brown eyes searching hers, and for the first time, it felt like he understood. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "We'll come here whenever you want, okay? You don't have to wait alone." Rachel smiled, standing up. "I think this is a good step. He knows he's not lost anymore." Emily ran a hand over Cooper's head. "Thank you for this, Rachel." Rachel watched as Cooper leaned into Emily's touch, his body finally relaxing. "I think he just needed to find home in a new way." As they walked back to the car, Cooper didn't hesitate, didn't resist. This time, when Emily opened the door, he jumped in willingly, his tail wagging just a little more than before. Rachel watched them drive away, feeling lighter than she had in days. There was still work to do, still healing ahead, but Cooper wasn't lost anymore. He had found what he was looking for, even if it wasn't exactly what he had expected. And now, at last, he had a chance to move forward. Rachel Monroe drove back to the shelter with a mixture of relief and contemplation swirling in her mind. Seeing Cooper find comfort at the park had been a step in the right direction, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his journey wasn't over. He had made progress, yet there was still something missing. That much was evident in the way he lingered under that tree, looking as if he expected something, or someone, to return. She pulled into the shelter's gravel parking lot, shutting off the engine and leaning back in her seat for a moment. The familiarity of the place was grounding, but it also served as a reminder of how much she had been pulled into Cooper's story. She had helped plenty of animals before, but this was different. Maybe because Cooper had found his way back to her twice, or maybe because his loyalty was unlike anything she had ever seen. Maggie was waiting just inside the doors as Rachel walked in, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto her. "You've got that look," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "The one that means you're about to dive even deeper into this." Rachel huffed a small laugh. "I can't help it. Cooper is doing better, but something tells me he's not done yet." Maggie nodded, leading Rachel into the staff area where a fresh pot of coffee was brewing. "Tell me everything." Rachel recounted her visit to Emily's house, Cooper's restless pacing, and the moment of clarity he had at the park. Maggie listened intently, sipping from her coffee mug. When Rachel finished, there was a moment of silence before Maggie spoke. "So what's next?" Rachel rubbed her temples. "That's the question, isn't it? He has a good home now. Emily wants to help him heal, but I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something." Maggie tapped her fingers against the table thoughtfully. What if Cooper isn't the only one struggling with this loss? What if Emily needs closure too? Rachel considered that. Emily had been focused on making Cooper feel safe, but she hadn't talked much about her own feelings. Grief wasn't just something that animals experienced. Humans did too, even if they expressed it differently. "Maybe you're right," Rachel admitted. "Maybe Cooper's healing is tied to Emily's. But how do we help with that? Maggie shrugged. You're the vet. I'm just the old lady who's seen a lot of people and animals work through their pain. But if I had to guess, I'd say it's about giving them both permission to move forward. Rachel nodded, letting the idea settle in her mind. I'll talk to Emily, see if she's open to the idea. The next day, Rachel called Emily and proposed an idea. An informal memorial for Bill at the park, the place he and Cooper had spent so much time together. There was a brief pause on the other end before Emily spoke, her voice thick with emotion. I think that's exactly what we need. They planned for the following weekend. It would be simple, just a few family members, close friends, and of course, Cooper. It wasn't about saying goodbye, but about honoring the bond Bill and Cooper had shared. The day of the memorial, Rachel arrived early to help set up. Emily's family had brought a framed photo of Bill with Cooper by his side, and they placed it near the tree where Cooper had sat days earlier. A few folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a small table held candles and flowers. It was understated, but perfect. Cooper seemed to sense the significance of the moment. He stayed close to Emily, his tail still, his eyes watchful. As people arrived, sharing quiet hugs and murmured conversations, Rachel couldn't help but notice how the energy in the space shifted. It wasn't heavy with sadness. It was filled with warmth, with love. When everyone was settled, Emily stood, clearing her throat. Thank you all for coming. I know my dad would have loved this, being here, in the place where he spent so much time with Cooper. She glanced down at the dog beside her, smiling through her tears. He always said that dogs teach us more about love than we teach them. I think Cooper has been reminding me of that every day. Rachel felt a lump form in her throat as Emily continued, sharing memories of Bill, his patience, his humor, the way he always made time for the people and animals he loved. Others spoke, too, each story painting a picture of a man who had left an undeniable mark on those around him. As the ceremony wrapped up, Emily knelt beside Cooper, resting a hand on his back. We're going to be okay, buddy. We'll keep moving forward. Together. For the first time since Rachel had met him, Cooper didn't hesitate. He licked Emily's hand, then looked up at her with an expression that felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had finally lifted. Later, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and people began heading home, Rachel and Emily stood by the tree, watching Cooper sniff lazily at the grass. I think you were right, Emily said, glancing at Rachel. I needed this as much as he did. Rachel smiled. Healing isn't just about time, it's about finding the right moments. Emily nodded, exhaling deeply. Thank you, Rachel, for everything. Rachel reached down to scratch behind Cooper's ears. You two are going to be just fine. And for the first time, she truly believed it. Rachel Monroe watched as Emily and Cooper walked away from the park that evening, something lighter in their steps. The gathering had given them both something they needed, a bridge between grief and healing. But Rachel knew Cooper's journey wasn't over yet, nor was Emily's. She had seen enough cases like this to understand that healing came in layers, and sometimes those layers unraveled in unexpected ways. The drive back to the shelter was quiet, her mind running through everything that had happened. Cooper had finally started settling, but there was still something in his eyes that Rachel couldn't ignore. A dog like him, one who had spent so long searching, didn't just forget that instinct overnight. The question remained, what exactly had he been searching for? And was there still something left undone? The next morning, Rachel arrived at the shelter earlier than usual. The air was crisp, and the smell of fresh grass mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the small pot in the break room. Maggie was already there, flipping through some paperwork, though she quickly set it aside when she saw Rachel. "You're up early," Maggie noted, raising an eyebrow. "Still thinking about Cooper?" Rachel exhaled. "I can't help it. He's settling in, but there's something missing. I just don't know what yet." Maggie nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not something you can solve. Maybe it's something Emily and Cooper need to figure out together." Rachel considered that. "Maybe. But I still have this feeling, like there's something we haven't uncovered yet." Maggie leaned back in her chair. "So what's your next move?" Rachel hesitated. She wasn't sure if there was a next move, but something deep inside her told her not to let this go just yet. "I want to check in with Emily in a few days. Give them time to settle, but also see if anything new comes up." Maggie smiled knowingly. "You're invested in this one," Rachel chuckled. "You say that like it's a bad thing." "Not bad," Maggie said, shaking her head. "Just different. I've seen you care about plenty of animals, Rachel. But this one? It's like you're following a trail." Rachel didn't deny it. "I guess I am. And I don't think it's over yet." 3 days passed before Rachel picked up the phone and dialed Emily's number. It rang twice before Emily answered, her voice warm but tinged with something Rachel couldn't quite place. "Hey, Rachel," Emily greeted. "I was actually just thinking about calling you." Rachel straightened. "Oh? How's Cooper doing?" There was a pause. "He's better, but something happened last night." Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" Emily sighed. "He woke me up in the middle of the night barking at the front door. It wasn't his usual bark. It was urgent, like he needed me to follow him. When I opened the door, he bolted outside like he was looking for something. He ran down the street, sniffing the air, circling back, whining. I had to chase after him just to bring him back inside." Rachel's heart pounded. "That's unusual. Did he seem scared?" "Not scared," Emily said. "More like determined, like he thought he was supposed to find something." Rachel's mind raced. "Do you live near anything that might be familiar to him? Maybe a place Bill used to take him that we haven't thought of yet?" Emily hesitated. "There is one place. My dad had an old workshop on the edge of town. He spent a lot of time there, but I haven't been since he passed. It's been locked up." Rachel felt a chill run through her. "I think we should take Cooper there. If he's still searching for something, maybe that's what he's looking for." Emily agreed, and later that afternoon they met outside the workshop. It was a small building, weathered from years of use, the paint chipping from the wooden exterior. Cooper immediately perked up as they approached, his tail stiff, his ears alert. He pulled at the leash, his body tense with anticipation. Emily fumbled with the key before unlocking the door. As soon as it creaked open, Cooper darted inside, his nose to the ground, sniffing furiously. Emily and Rachel exchanged glances before stepping in after him. The air inside was thick with dust, the scent of old wood and metal filling the space. Tools lined the walls, and a workbench sat in the center of the room, covered in a thin layer of dust. Cooper moved quickly, weaving through the space as if following an invisible path. Then he stopped suddenly, his nose pressed against an old wooden chest in the corner. Rachel crouched beside him, running a hand over the worn surface. "Emily, do you know what's in here?" Emily shook her head, kneeling next to her. "I haven't touched anything since my dad passed." Rachel hesitated, then carefully lifted the lid. Inside were old photos, notebooks, and a faded red bandana. Cooper let out a soft whimper and nosed at the bandana, his tail giving a small wag for the first time in days. Emily picked up the bandana, running it between her fingers. This was my dad's. He used to wear it when he worked out here. Cooper must recognize the scent. Rachel felt a lump in her throat. This must be what he was looking for. Something familiar, something that still had a part of Bill in it. Emily pressed the bandana to her chest, blinking back tears. I didn't know he still needed this. I thought bringing him home was enough. Rachel placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. Sometimes we don't know what we need until we find it. Cooper sat beside Emily, his body finally relaxed, his eyes softer than they had been since Rachel first met him. He wasn't searching anymore. He had found what he was looking for. Emily exhaled a shaky breath. Thank you for bringing me here, and for helping me see what he needed. Rachel smiled. You're giving him what he needs now. That's what matters. As they left the workshop, Emily carried the bandana in her hand, and Cooper walked beside her with a new ease in his step. For the first time, Rachel truly believed that Cooper had finally found peace. But as she watched them drive away, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. There was still something about this story that didn't quite feel complete, and Rachel wasn't ready to walk away just yet. Rachel sat in her car outside the workshop long after Emily and Cooper had left. Something about the entire situation still nagged at her. Cooper had found comfort in Bill's bandana, but that didn't mean his journey was over. There was something unspoken in the way he had searched the workshop so frantically, as if there was more to uncover. Rachel had always trusted her instincts, and they were telling her that this wasn't over yet. She stepped out of the car and walked back inside the workshop, the wooden door creaking behind her as she entered. The scent of dust and aging wood filled the air, and the dim light filtering through the windows cast long shadows over the space. Her eyes scanned the walls lined with tools and old blueprints, and then back to the wooden chest where they had found Bill's bandana. Something about the way Cooper had reacted to the chest made her pause. Rachel knelt down and opened it again, pushing past the notebooks and old photographs. Her fingers brushed against something solid near the bottom. Frowning, she reached deeper and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was thick, filled with pages that had yellowed with time. Bill's name was scrawled on the cover in faded ink. Her breath hitched. She had a feeling this journal held something important. She flipped through the first few pages, scanning Bill's handwriting. The entries weren't just about his day-to-day life. They were about Cooper. Each page was filled with notes about their daily walks, how Cooper responded to different commands, the tricks Bill had taught him. Rachel's heart clenched at the evident love Bill had for his dog. But as she kept reading, the notes became more scattered, more hurried, as if Bill had been racing against time to record something vital. One particular entry caught her attention. Cooper keeps pacing at night, sitting by the front door like he's waiting for someone. I thought at first it was just his routine, but now I'm not so sure. He's been acting strange, sniffing the air like he's searching for something. I think he knows something I don't. Rachel reread the passage, her mind racing. Bill had noticed Cooper's strange behavior even before his passing. Was this connected to why Cooper had traveled so far? Was there something, or someone, he had been looking for all along? Determined to find out more, Rachel closed the journal and tucked it under her arm before stepping out of the workshop. The sun had begun to set, casting the sky in deep hues of orange and pink. She needed to talk to Emily about this. Maybe she could make sense of why Cooper had been acting this way for so long. She drove to Emily's house, the journal resting on the passenger seat beside her. When she arrived, she saw Emily sitting on the porch, Cooper lying at her feet. His ears perked up when he saw Rachel, but there was still a distant look in his eyes. Emily stood as Rachel approached. "Rachel, what's wrong?" Rachel held up the journal. "I found this in your dad's workshop. It's filled with notes about Cooper, and there's something in here that I think you should see." Emily took the journal, flipping through the pages with furrowed brows. As she read the passage Rachel had marked, her expression turned to confusion. Waiting for someone? That doesn't make sense. He was always with my dad. Who else would he be waiting for? Rachel hesitated. "I don't know. But I think this is why he kept running away from every home. He wasn't just searching for Bill. He was looking for something else." Emily sat down slowly, the journal resting on her lap. If my dad noticed it before he passed, then whatever Cooper was sensing must have been happening for a while. But what was it? Rachel sat beside her, deep in thought. Maybe we need to retrace Cooper's steps. Try to figure out where he was before he got lost. If we can find out where he was trying to go, maybe we can get some answers. Emily nodded. There's only one way to find out. The next morning, Rachel and Emily set off with Cooper, retracing the possible routes he could have taken when he escaped from the transport company. They drove past familiar streets and through the outskirts of town, stopping at places Cooper might recognize. But none of them sparked a reaction in him. He sniffed around but never showed the urgency he had before. They were beginning to lose hope when Emily's phone rang. She answered quickly, her expression shifting as she listened. "You're sure? Okay, we'll be there soon." She hung up and turned to Rachel. "That was one of my dad's old neighbors. She said she remembers seeing Cooper the day he went missing, but not near the transport company. She saw him miles away, near an old cabin my dad used to visit when he wanted some quiet time." Rachel's heart pounded. That's where we need to go. They drove in silence, the anticipation thick in the air. The cabin was deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and overgrown grass. As soon as they pulled up, Cooper became alert, his body tense. He whined softly, then bolted toward the front door, scratching at it desperately. Emily quickly unlocked the door, and Cooper rushed inside, sniffing wildly. Rachel and Emily exchanged a glance before stepping in after him. The air inside was stale, the cabin untouched since Bill's passing. But Cooper wasn't just exploring. He was searching for something. Rachel scanned the room, her gaze falling on an old wooden desk in the corner. There were papers scattered across it, along with an old photograph. She picked it up and studied it carefully. It was a picture of Bill, Cooper, and a man Rachel didn't recognize. Emily gasped. "That's my dad. But who is that with him?" Rachel turned the photograph over. There was a note written on the back. "Tom and I finally got everything squared away. Hope Cooper adjusts well." Emily's eyes widened. "Tom? My dad never mentioned a Tom." Rachel's mind raced. What if Tom is the person Cooper has been looking for? If he was important to Bill, then maybe Cooper thought he needed to find him. Emily shook her head. But why? And where is he now? Rachel looked at Cooper, who had stopped searching and was now sitting quietly by the desk, as if he had found his answer. "I think we need to find out who Tom is. He might be the missing piece in all of this." Emily nodded, determination in her eyes. "Then let's find him." Cooper sat beside them, his gaze steady and knowing. It was as if he had been leading them to this all along. But the question remained. Who was Tom? And why was Cooper still searching for him? Rachel knew they were close to an answer. But something told her the real journey was only just beginning. Rachel and Emily spent the next few days digging through everything they could find on Tom. It wasn't easy. Bill had never mentioned him to Emily, and there weren't any other obvious clues beyond the photograph they found at the cabin. But Rachel wasn't ready to let this go. Something told her that Cooper's search wasn't over yet. Emily sat on her couch, sifting through old documents her father had left behind. Bills, letters, receipts, nothing that immediately stood out. Rachel sat across from her, laptop open, searching through any available records she could find. "Anything?" Emily asked, glancing up. Rachel shook her head. "Nothing useful. The name Tom isn't exactly uncommon. If we had a last name, maybe." Cooper lay at their feet, his ears flicking occasionally as if he was listening to every word. Rachel absent-mindedly reached down to scratch behind his ears. Emily sighed, setting aside another stack of papers. "I just don't get it. If this man was so important to my dad, why didn't he ever mention him? Why leave just a single picture and that note?" Rachel drummed her fingers on the keyboard, thinking. Maybe your dad didn't want to bring it up. Maybe it was something from his past he didn't want to revisit. Emily frowned. But if that's the case, why was it important enough to be here at the cabin? And why does Cooper still seem like he's searching? Rachel chewed on the inside of her cheek. There has to be something we're missing. Cooper suddenly lifted his head, ears perking up. His gaze was sharp, focused on the front door. Emily noticed. That's how he looked the night he bolted from the house. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. You think he senses something? Before Emily could answer, Cooper stood and walked toward the door, his tail stiff, but not wagging. He wasn't anxious. He was alert. Rachel stood. I think he wants us to follow him. Emily grabbed her jacket. Then let's go. They followed Cooper out to the car, watching as he climbed in willingly. Rachel and Emily exchanged a look before Rachel started the engine. Cooper sat up in the back seat, watching the road like he knew exactly where they were supposed to go. Rachel drove slowly, watching for any indication from Cooper. He stayed calm for most of the ride, but when they neared the highway exit leading out of town, he suddenly let out a low whine and pressed his nose to the window. That's a reaction, Rachel said. Which way? Emily checked the road signs. This leads toward the next town over. Rachel merged onto the highway, keeping an eye on Cooper. The further they drove, the more restless he became. Finally, as they neared a quiet stretch of road leading toward a wooded area, Cooper let out a sharp bark and pressed his paws against the window. Emily's heart pounded. This is it. This is where he wants to go. Rachel slowed the car, pulling off onto a gravel side road. There wasn't much out here, just trees and an old service road that looked barely used. Cooper whined again, his tail wagging slightly now. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt. Let's see what he's found. They stepped out of the car, and Cooper jumped down immediately, his nose pressed to the ground as he sniffed furiously. He didn't hesitate. He took off toward the trees, moving with a sense of urgency Rachel hadn't seen before. Cooper, wait! Emily called, hurrying after him. Rachel followed, dodging low-hanging branches as they made their way through the trees. Cooper's pace slowed as he approached a clearing, his body tense, but not fearful. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. Then he let out a soft whine. Rachel and Emily stepped into the clearing behind him and froze. There was a small, abandoned cabin. It looked worn, the roof sagging slightly, the windows covered in dirt. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years, but Cooper was fixated on it, his tail wagging slightly as he moved toward the door. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Did my dad know about this place? Rachel shook her head. I don't know, but Cooper does. They followed him up to the porch. The wooden boards creaked under their feet, but the door was locked. Rachel tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Emily hesitated. Should we? Before Rachel could answer, a voice called out from behind them. Can I help you? They spun around, startled. An older man stood at the edge of the clearing, dressed in worn jeans and a thick flannel jacket. His hair was gray, his face lined with age, but his eyes were sharp as they studied them. Cooper turned toward him immediately, his body language shifting. He wasn't wary. He was curious. Rachel cleared her throat. We were following Cooper. He led us here. The man's gaze flicked down to the dog, and something in his expression changed. It softened. That's Bill's dog, isn't it? Emily sucked in a breath. You knew my dad? The man exhaled slowly, stepping closer. Yeah, I knew Bill. His voice was quiet, almost distant. I'm Tom. Rachel and Emily exchanged a stunned glance. Emily took a step forward. How did you know my dad? Tom hesitated, looking at the cabin, then back at them. It's a long story, but I think it's time you heard it. Rachel's pulse quickened. Whatever this was, it was what Cooper had been leading them toward all along. And now, at last, they were going to get some answers. Rachel and Emily stood in stunned silence, staring at the man who had just introduced himself as Tom. The same Tom they had been searching for, the one Cooper had led them to. The man who, somehow, had been connected to Bill all these years without Emily ever knowing. Emily took a step forward, her voice unsteady. You knew my dad? She repeated, the words feeling foreign as she said them. Tom exhaled slowly and nodded. Yeah, I knew Bill, he said, glancing down at Cooper, who was watching him intently. And it looks like Cooper still remembers me. Cooper's tail gave a small wag, and he took a hesitant step closer to Tom, sniffing the air as if confirming something only he could recognize. Rachel felt her chest tighten. There was history here, something layered and unspoken, and it was clear that whatever it was, Cooper had known all along. Tom sighed and looked back at the cabin. You might want to sit down. This is a long story. Emily hesitated, but Rachel placed a reassuring hand on her back. They followed Tom onto the creaking porch and sat on the wooden steps. Cooper settled between them, his ears flicking, his body calm. He had done what he was meant to do. He had led them here. Tom took a deep breath. Bill and I go way back. We met in the military, served together for years. We were stationed overseas at the same time, went through things most people wouldn't understand. He was my closest friend. After we got out, we stayed in touch, but life got in the way. He moved back here, and I ended up drifting. Emily listened intently, her fingers tightening on her knees. So why didn't I ever hear about you? Tom let out a humorless chuckle. Because I left, and I never came back. He rubbed his jaw, clearly struggling to find the right words. Your dad and I had a falling out. It wasn't anything terrible, just two people who saw things differently. He wanted stability, wanted to settle down. I wasn't ready for that. I thought I needed to keep moving to find something else. But Bill, he was solid. He knew what he wanted. Rachel watched the emotions flicker across Emily's face. It was one thing to learn your father had a past you never knew about. It was another to find out that someone so important to him had been absent for so long. Tom exhaled. The last time I saw him, we argued. Not over anything important, just stupid pride. I told myself I'd see him again eventually, that I had time. Then I heard he passed. He swallowed hard. By the time I got back here, it was too late. I never got to say goodbye. Emily's eyes glistened. That doesn't explain Cooper. Why was he looking for you? Tom looked at Cooper, his expression softening. Bill must have mentioned me. Maybe not by name, but dogs remember more than we give them credit for. Cooper knew there was someone missing. He must have felt it, sensed it. And when Bill was gone, he thought he had to find me. Rachel let out a slow breath. It made sense, in a way. Dogs understood loss, but they also understood unfinished things. Cooper hadn't just been searching for Bill. He had been looking for someone who could fill that void, someone Bill had left behind. Emily wiped at her eyes. All this time, he wasn't lost. He was just trying to put things back together. Tom nodded. And I should have been here sooner. But I didn't think I had the right to show up after all these years. Rachel shook her head. You have that chance now. And maybe that's what Cooper was trying to tell you. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years settling between them. Then, Cooper let out a deep sigh, the kind of contented sound that told them he had finally found what he had been looking for. Emily took a deep breath and looked at Tom. I don't know if my dad would have wanted you to carry guilt. He wasn't that kind of person. If you meant something to him, then you were part of his life, whether you were here or not. Tom's throat bobbed as he nodded. I'd like to make things right, if you'll let me. Emily hesitated, then reached down, running a hand through Cooper's fur. I think Cooper already made that decision for us. Rachel watched as Tom reached down, giving Cooper a gentle scratch behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch, his body finally, truly at ease. This wasn't the end of Cooper's journey, or Emily's, or even Tom's, but it was a new beginning. And as the sun started to dip behind the trees, Rachel knew that sometimes the past didn't need to be left behind. It just needed to find its way home. The drive back was quiet. Rachel kept glancing at Emily in the passenger seat, noting the way she kept rubbing her thumb against her palm, lost in thought. Cooper lay in the back, his breathing steady, finally at ease. Tom had watched them go, his expression unreadable, but there had been something in his eyes, something that said he wasn't going to disappear again. Emily finally broke the silence. I don't even know what to think. My dad had a whole chapter of his life that I never knew about. And now this man, this stranger, just walks in and knows things about him that I don't. Rachel nodded. It's a lot. And it's okay if you don't know how to feel about it yet. Emily exhaled, shaking her head. I'm not angry, not exactly. I always thought I knew my dad. And now I wonder what else I didn't know. Rachel kept her hands steady on the wheel. It doesn't mean you didn't know him. People keep parts of themselves private, even from the people they love the most. Maybe it wasn't about hiding it from you. Maybe it was just something he didn't talk about. Emily was quiet for a long time. I don't know if I want to see Tom again, but I don't know if I don't either. Rachel smiled slightly. Then don't decide right now. Let it sit. See how it feels later. Emily nodded, folding her arms as she stared out the window. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the silence of someone trying to rearrange pieces of a puzzle they hadn't known existed. When they pulled up to Emily's house, Cooper perked up, recognizing the familiar surroundings. Rachel parked, and Emily turned to her, her expression softer now. Thanks for everything today. Rachel smiled. You don't have to thank me. You and Cooper have been on this journey together. I'm just here to help when I can. Emily nodded and opened the door. Cooper hopped out and stretched before padding up the walkway. Emily hesitated before following, glancing back at Rachel one more time before heading inside. Rachel sat there for a moment, watching the house, wondering what would come next. Back at the shelter, Maggie was waiting for her, arms crossed. You're late, Rachel sighed, tossing her keys onto the desk. You wouldn't believe the day I had. Maggie smirked. Oh, I believe it. I've been keeping an eye on the news. The shelter's website has been blowing up since Cooper's story got out. Rachel raised an eyebrow. His story? Maggie turned her computer screen toward her. Someone must have talked. There's an article about how Cooper traveled all that way looking for something, and people are eating it up. Donations are pouring in, applications too. Rachel rubbed her forehead. Great. More people wanting to adopt a dog who already has a home? Maggie grinned. Maybe. Or maybe people just want to support the shelter. Either way, it's good press. Rachel sighed, scrolling through the website. Sure enough, there were comments, messages, and inquiries flooding in. People were fascinated by Cooper's journey, by his loyalty. Rachel couldn't blame them. It was rare to see something so pure, so unshakable. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. A text from Emily. Thinking about going back to talk to Tom. Not sure yet, just thought you should know. Rachel smiled to herself before typing back. Take your time. You'll know what feels right. As she set her phone down, she glanced over at Maggie. Guess I should get used to people asking about Cooper for a while. Maggie laughed. Better you than me. Rachel chuckled, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that Cooper's story wasn't quite finished yet. There were still questions, still things left unsaid, and as she sat back in her chair, she had a feeling she'd be hearing from Emily again very soon. Rachel tapped her fingers against the desk as she stared at her phone, waiting. Emily hadn't responded since her last message about considering a visit to Tom. Rachel didn't want to push, but she couldn't help wondering what Emily was thinking. Cooper's journey had led them to this point, but there was still more to uncover. Maggie poked her head into the office, a mug of coffee in her hand. Still waiting for an update? Rachel exhaled. She said she was thinking about going to see Tom, but I haven't heard anything since. Maggie took a slow sip. Give her time. That's a big decision. Meeting someone from her father's past isn't something she's going to jump into overnight. Rachel nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring beneath the surface. Cooper had found Tom for a reason, and Emily had been the missing link in a puzzle they didn't yet fully understand. The chime of Rachel's phone startled her. It was a text from Emily. I'm outside Tom's cabin. I haven't knocked yet. Rachel typed quickly. You don't have to if you're not ready, but if you want to, I'm here. Minutes passed before another response. I'm going in. Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, willing time to move faster. An hour later, her phone buzzed again. Emily. I talked to him. There's a lot I didn't know. I don't even know where to start. Rachel's pulse quickened. You want to meet up? Yeah. Can I come to the shelter? Of course. When Emily arrived, she had a look Rachel had seen before, the look of someone who had just uncovered something life-changing. Cooper, who had been resting by the front desk, immediately perked up when she walked in. His tail wagged softly, but he didn't rush to her. He simply watched, as if waiting for her to speak first. Emily knelt down, scratching behind his ears. You really did know what you were doing, huh? She murmured. Rachel gestured to one of the chairs in her office. Take your time. Tell me everything when you're ready. Emily sat down heavily, running a hand through her hair. Tom wasn't just my dad's old friend. He was family. Not by blood, but they were closer than brothers. My dad never talked about him because he felt guilty. Rachel frowned. Guilty? Emily nodded. When they were younger, before I was born, My dad and Tom had planned to start a business together, some kind of woodworking shop. But my dad met my mom, and things changed. He wanted stability, a family. Tom still wanted to chase the dream they'd talked about for years. They argued. Tom left. My dad always thought he abandoned him, but Tom felt abandoned too. Rachel listened, piecing it together. So, Cooper? Emily exhaled. My dad must have mentioned Tom more than I ever realized. Maybe Cooper picked up on that, and when my dad passed, he thought it was his job to fix what was broken. He didn't just want to find Tom, he wanted to bring him back. Rachel swallowed hard. And now? What does Tom want? Emily hesitated. He regrets leaving. He never meant to be gone forever. He just didn't know how to come back. And when he finally thought about reaching out, it was too late. Rachel saw the emotion in Emily's eyes, the weight of what she had learned settling in. What do you want to do now? Emily let out a long breath. I don't know yet. Tom wants to meet again. I think I want to too. But I need to process all of this first. Rachel nodded. That's fair. There's no rush. Cooper leaned against Emily's leg, letting out a quiet sigh. It was as if he understood that his job wasn't over, but things were finally starting to make sense. Emily smiled faintly, running her fingers through his fur. You really are something else. You know that? Rachel watched as Cooper's tail gave a slow, steady wag. He hadn't just brought them to Tom. He had brought them to the truth. And even though there were still more questions to answer, it finally felt like they were moving in the right direction. The morning was still and quiet, with only the occasional chirp of a bird breaking the silence. Rachel stood outside the shelter, her coffee in hand, and stared down the road that led into town. Emily hadn't followed up after their last conversation, and Rachel hadn't wanted to press. She figured Emily needed space to figure out her next steps. Cooper, however, had seemed calmer since that day. Even now, as Rachel glanced through the front window of the shelter, she could see him lying in his usual spot near the reception desk, resting easily. Hey, you out here brooding, or just taking in the scenery? Maggie called as she stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind her. Rachel smiled faintly. Just thinking. About Emily and Tom again? Maggie asked knowingly. Rachel nodded. I can't help it. I keep wondering what's next for them, and for Cooper. It's like we've come so far, but I still feel like something's unresolved. Maggie crossed her arms, leaning against the side of the building. Maybe it's not about getting all the answers. Maybe it's about knowing that you've done all you could, and then letting them take it from here. Rachel considered that. Maybe. Before Maggie could say more, Rachel's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, squinting against the sun's glare. It was a text from Emily. I'm going to see Tom again. Just wanted to let you know. Rachel replied quickly. Take your time. You've got this. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and sighed. She's going back to talk to Tom. Maggie smiled slightly. Well, there's your next chapter. You think she'll bring Cooper along? Rachel glanced through the window again, watching Cooper stir from his nap. Maybe. He might be the key to getting them to connect. A few hours later, Rachel was in her office when her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Emily calling. Rachel answered on the second ring. Hey, Emily said, her voice steady but tinged with something Rachel couldn't quite place. I just got back from Tom's. Rachel straightened in her chair. How did it go? It was intense, Emily admitted. He told me more about their friendship, about the plans they had. I think my dad really struggled with that chapter of his life more than I ever realized. Did it help, hearing it from him? Rachel asked. Emily hesitated. It did, in a way, but it also brought up a lot of emotions I didn't expect. I don't think it's something I can process in just one visit. Rachel nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. That makes sense. Healing isn't quick. Emily sighed. Cooper was a big help, though. It's like he knew exactly when to sit by my side and when to go over to Tom. He's such a special dog. Rachel smiled. He is. I just wanted to thank you again, Emily continued. I don't know if I would have gone through with any of this without you. You don't need to thank me, Rachel said softly. You're doing the hard part. There was a pause before Emily said, I think I'm going to keep visiting him. Not right away, but eventually. There's a lot to untangle, but I feel like it's worth it. Rachel's heart felt a bit lighter. I'm glad. Take it one step at a time. They said their goodbyes, and Rachel set her phone down, a faint smile on her face. Maggie appeared in the doorway moments later, a clipboard in hand. Good news? Maggie asked. Rachel nodded. Emily's starting to find her way. And Cooper? Rachel glanced out the window again, where Cooper had resumed his nap in the sunshine. I think he's finally where he belongs. Maggie smiled knowingly. And what about you, Rachel? Where do you belong in all of this? Rachel considered that for a moment before answering. Right here, for now, helping the next dog find their way. Maggie patted her shoulder. Sounds like a good plan to me. Rachel chuckled softly. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace settling in. Cooper's journey wasn't over, and neither was Emily's, but they were on the right path. And for Rachel, that was more than enough. The days that followed were quieter than Rachel expected. Emily hadn't been by the shelter, though Rachel had no doubt she was keeping busy, processing everything she'd learned about Tom, her father, and the unexpected pieces of the past that had come to light. Rachel found herself thinking about them often, wondering how Emily and Cooper were doing, whether they'd found some kind of rhythm in their new normal. Cooper had been spending more time at Emily's place, but he still visited the shelter regularly. Whenever Rachel saw him, he looked content. He'd walk in with that steady, deliberate pace, sniff around the reception area, and then find a sunny spot to lie down. Sometimes he'd nap. Other times he'd just watch the world go by. Maggie often commented on how calm he seemed now. It was as though he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. One morning, while Rachel was reviewing the shelter's latest intake records, her phone buzzed. She picked it up and saw Emily's name on the screen. Smiling, she answered, Hey, Emily, how's it going? Emily's voice sounded lighter than it had in their last conversation. Hey, Rachel, I just wanted to check in. Things are good. I mean, there's still a lot I'm sorting through, but I feel like I'm getting somewhere. Rachel leaned back in her chair, relieved. That's great to hear. How's Cooper doing? He's amazing, Emily said, and Rachel could hear the smile in her voice. It's like he knows I needed him. He's been so patient, so calm. I take him for walks every day now, and we spend time at the park. He's really been my rock through all of this. Rachel's heart warmed. I'm glad to hear that. He's always had a way of knowing exactly what people need. He really has, Emily agreed. There was a pause, and then she added, I've been visiting Tom more. We've been talking a lot about my dad, about their friendship. I'm learning so much I never knew. It's bittersweet, but it's also good. Rachel nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. Sometimes the hardest things to face are the ones that bring the most clarity. Emily exhaled. Yeah, that's exactly how it feels. They chatted a little longer about Cooper, about Tom, about the small steps Emily was taking toward understanding and healing. By the time Rachel hung up, she felt lighter too. It was good to hear Emily's progress, to know that she and Cooper were both finding their way. That afternoon, Cooper came into the shelter as if on cue. Rachel watched as he strolled through the front door and made his way to the reception desk. He paused to sniff at a box of donated toys, then settled onto the floor with a contented sigh. Maggie, who had been updating the adoption board, glanced down at him and chuckled. "Well, look who's back," she said, smiling at Rachel. "He sure knows where he's loved." Rachel leaned against the counter. "He's got a way of reminding us what's important." Maggie smirked. "Sounds like he's done his job." Rachel thought about that. Cooper had been the catalyst for so much, bringing Emily and Tom back together, helping Emily find the truth about her dad's past, and showing everyone at the shelter what it meant to truly care. And even though his journey wasn't over, it was clear he'd already made an impact that would last a lifetime. Emily watched as Cooper trotted ahead, his tail wagging slowly, his ears perked and alert. The park had become their special place, a quiet retreat where she could think, and where Cooper could simply be a dog. Today, the morning air was crisp and clear, and the sunlight filtered through the trees in gentle streaks, making the world feel just a bit more vibrant. She glanced around the park, taking in the subtle, peaceful sounds that filled the space. Birds chirped softly in the distance, their melodies blending with the gentle rustling of leaves in the light breeze. For a moment, Emily closed her eyes and simply breathed. This place felt more than serene. It felt alive, as though it carried its own memory of all the moments she and Cooper had shared here. When she opened her eyes, Cooper had paused by a patch of tall grass, his nose twitching as he investigated a new scent. She watched him with a small, warm smile, marveling at how much he had changed. Gone was the anxious pacing and the restless searching. Now his movements were purposeful, but unhurried. He seemed to enjoy every step, every new discovery, and that calm had settled into her as well. She leaned against a worn wooden bench, pulling her jacket tighter around her. It had been months since she first found out about Tom, and each visit to him had brought new stories, new insights into her father's life. They hadn't rushed anything. The pieces had come together slowly, one conversation at a time. But now, Emily felt she finally had a full picture of who her father had been. Not just the man who raised her, but the man who had lived an entire life before she was even born. A man with dreams, with close bonds, with struggles she hadn't known. Cooper sniffed along the base of a tree, pausing to lift his head and look back at her. She smiled and gestured for him to come over. He loped toward her, his movements easy and natural, the weight that had once seemed to press down on him, now gone. He reached her side and sat, leaning into her leg. She scratched behind his ears and felt a warmth spread through her chest. "You've brought us all together, haven't you?" she murmured, her voice carrying a note of gratitude. "Somehow you just knew what we needed." Cooper turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers for a moment. There was something almost knowing in his gaze, a quiet understanding that no words could convey. She ran her hand down his back, feeling the smoothness of his fur, the steady rhythm of his breathing. He was her constant now, her anchor in the whirlwind of changes she had faced. A rustle behind her drew her attention. Emily turned to see Tom walking up the path, his hands in his jacket pockets. His steps were slow, deliberate, and his face carried the same calm expression she had come to know over their recent visits. When he reached her, he gave a small nod, his eyes shifting to Cooper. "He's something else," Tom said, his voice low but warm. It's like he's always known where to go. Emily smiled. He's always had that sense. He's brought me so much closer to Dad's story, to you, to everything I didn't know I needed. Tom stepped closer, looking down at Cooper as the dog thumped his tail. Your dad was proud of him. He used to say that Cooper was the best friend he'd ever had. Emily felt a lump in her throat. I think Dad would be proud of all of us right now, she said softly, for finding our way back to each other. Tom nodded, his gaze thoughtful. He'd want you to know how much he loved you, how much he wanted the best for you. He never stopped talking about you, even when we were young. Emily smiled, blinking away the moisture in her eyes. Thank you for telling me that. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, Emily, Tom, and Cooper, surrounded by the sounds of bird song and rustling leaves. It was a moment of peace, of resolution, even if it wasn't spoken out loud. When Tom eventually said goodbye and walked back toward his truck, Emily stayed on the bench with Cooper. She didn't feel the need to rush home. The park was their space, a place where the past and the present felt balanced. She looked at Cooper, his ears twitching as he listened to the world around him, and realized that she had everything she needed. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt whole. Her father's memory was no longer something that haunted her. It was a part of her life with Cooper, and even with Tom, and the three of them had formed a new bond, one built on understanding and love. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. As the sun climbed higher, warming the cool morning air, Emily took a deep breath and smiled. Come on, Cooper, she said. Let's go home.